Hi everyone! As you know, the topic for this week is flowers and reproduction. We're going to talk a little bit about plant reproduction in general terms. We're going to talk about plant life cycles, and then we'll spend a little time talking about the parts of a flower. So we'll start by thinking about sexual versus asexual reproduction in plants, talk about plant evolutionary history, then get into life cycles, and then floral structure. So first, let's think about sexual versus asexual reproduction in plants. Take a minute, stop the lecture, jot down what you know about those two different forms of reproduction, and then start back up again. So, asexual reproduction. If a plant is reproducing asexually, then all of the offspring are going to be genetically identical to the parent and to each other. So they're all exactly the same genetically. And that has some really important implications ecologically. So every individual is going to be equally adapted to environmental conditions as the parent was. None will be more adapted, none will be less. So if environmental conditions change, then any change in the habitat will equally improve or worsen conditions for all of the individuals of that species. As you see here, there's a picture of cattails in a wetland. They're all genetically probably the same. This version of reproduction allows for very rapid colonization because even isolated individuals can reproduce. If you just have one individual, that individual can form new individuals, and reproduction can happen quickly, and the species can spread across a new habitat. But as I said, the habitat change can conceivably be negative for the whole group. So under certain kinds of conditions, it may be a little riskier. Conditions of rapid environmental change, for example, could be dangerous for a species that reproduces primarily asexually. If we think about sexual reproduction, in this instance, the offspring are going to be very genetically diverse. So no two individuals, if sexual reproduction is the predominant form, are going to be genetically identical. And this can have benefits and disadvantages as well. So offspring can be either less or more adapted to a site than the parents because of that genetic diversity. This is the underpinnings of natural selection. So if all the individuals are slightly different from each other and habitat conditions change, then some of those individuals may do really well in the new environmental conditions and be more successful, and others perhaps less so. So changes in the habitat can be positive for some and negative for others, and that allows for adaptation to a new environment or to a changing environment. A disadvantage of sexual reproduction is that isolated individuals cannot reproduce at all. So you have to have multiple individuals. You have to have at least a male and a female in order for reproduction to happen. Let's take a minute to think about the evolutionary history of plants. So if we look up here at the top of the screen, you can see the groups of plants moving from left to right, from less developed, less complex, say, and older ancestrally, to the younger plants, the ones to have evolved more recently. We move from the algae on the far left to the mosses, the lycophytes like the club mosses you might see in the forest, the ferns, the gymnosperms, the pines and the spruces, and then the angiosperms, the flowering plants that we've spent a lot of time focusing on in here. This axis here is time. So you can see that the plants on the far left are the ones that evolved longer ago here. And all these plants share a common green algal ancestor based on our understanding of the evolution of plants. You can look at these categories here to see how plants have evolved through time to form these different groups. So they all share a common green algal ancestor. And then through time, some of the individuals of that original algal group would have developed protection for the embryo, and that was the forerunner to all the rest of the plants. Through time, vascular tissues developed that separated out the mosses from all the rest of the plant groups. Then megaphylls, or the larger, more complex leaves, developed that separates the ferns out from the lycophytes. Ultimately, we get to the place where we have seeds, seed plants. Having the adaptation of seeds protects reproduction tremendously because those seed packets can wait until conditions are right for germination. And then finally, on the far right, development of flowers, which is the adaptation that makes the angiosperms distinct largely from the other groups. So you can see here the circle showing you the division of the seed plants and ultimately the angiosperms. Stop and think for just a second about what the purpose of a flower would be. What is the point of a flower, and why would that be an important adaptation? You can stop for a second. So flowers are really key for a couple different things. One of the areas that they're really important in is in attracting pollinators. So we talked about sexual reproduction and the isolation that can be a problem in that. Attracting insects and other organisms to the flowers to improve transfer of pollen from one flower to another is really critical in the angiosperms. There's also protective capacity in the fruit that forms in the flowering plants, and the ability to help with dispersal in the fruit. And so there are some really important functions that reproductive structure can carry out. Okay, let's talk for a minute about the life cycle of a plant. Plants have a two-stage life cycle. They have an alternation of generations. And this takes some explanation because we are used to thinking of the life cycle of an animal, which is a single stage. Think for a minute about this diagram that you see here. We need to review some terminology in order to understand this difference. So take just a minute, before I explain this diagram, take just a minute to look at it and try to understand what's going on here based on information you've covered in prior courses. Think about the terminology that you might remember in terms of whether organisms are diploid or haploid. Are we diploid or are we haploid? Think about ways in which cells divide through the processes of mitosis versus meiosis and what the distinction is between those two. And simply think through, based on that terminology, what seems to be going on in this diagram. And then come back to the lecture after you've done that. So before we talk through that life cycle in detail, let's review some of this terminology. We'll start over here on the left with the difference between haploid and diploid. If you said that we are all diploid, you were correct. We have, as you see here, 2 complete sets of chromosomes in each of our cells. A haploid organism would have 1 complete set of chromosomes in each cell. Let's talk for a minute then also about the 2 processes of mitosis and meiosis. Those are cell division processes that are related to whether the cell might be haploid or diploid. If a cell is simply dividing, if it's simply splitting in half, and the parent cell is going to divide in half and the resulting daughter cells are going to look identical to the parent, then that is the process of mitosis. And that will be true whether it's a haploid cell dividing or a diploid cell dividing. The offspring always look exactly the same in terms of the genetic material as the parent. Meiosis, in contrast, is a reduction division. So if we have a diploid cell here as the parent, then by the time we get to the daughter cells here, each daughter cell will have half as much genetic material as the parent. The cell will go from diploid to haploid in the process of meiosis. It's a reduction division. We're used to thinking about meiosis as the process that forms gametes in the animal life cycle, that the sperm and the egg are formed through a reduction division. The original parent is a diploid cell, and then the gametes themselves are haploid cells. And when they fuse, they form the new zygote that grows up again as a diploid cell. We'll see that on the next slide on the life cycle diagram. Plants can be a little different from that, and so that's why we need to make sure we get this terminology squared away. Okay, here's back to our life cycle. So now we understand that diploid organisms would have 2 complete sets of chromosomes in each cell, haploid organisms would have 1, and that if those cells are dividing and the resulting new cell is identical, that's a mitosis process. If there's a reduction division, then that's meiosis. So now let's look at this figure. We're talking about plants that have a 2-stage life cycle. They're alternating then between a haploid generation or a haploid state where all the cells in the organism have 1 complete set of chromosomes, and a diploid state where all the cells in the organism have 2 complete sets of chromosomes, which is quite different from what we're used to thinking about. So if we think about our life cycle, we're the equivalent of the plant sporophyte, which is the diploid stage. And when we produce gametes through the process of meiosis, the reduction division, when we get to this point here, what we form is gametes. But in the plant, that doesn't happen. In the plant, this reduction division of meiosis produces spores, which are, this is a reduction division, they are haploid, that grow up into a new version of the plant, the gametophyte, which is a haploid organism. And that haploid form of the plant produces the sperm and the egg, but now that happens by mitosis because we have a haploid organism that's producing haploid gametes. That's simply a regular division or a mitotic division. The sperm and the egg still fuse like we're used to thinking about. There's fertilization here to form a zygote that grows up into the embryo and forms a new sporophyte that's diploid. This is a very different life cycle from what we're used to thinking about.